So because this is being taped tonight, I'll try not to be too spontaneous, and I'll try not to sort of get involved with you and get you up and get you doing things. But after we finish the original presentation, then I think the tape is going to turn off, and then we can really have some question and answers, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty of it, which I'm hoping. This is the little handout. This is really nothing more than outline. Gives you a little bit of an idea, because sometimes when you go through this kind of content, it feels like a lot. And you don't really know after about 20 minutes what you're hearing, because you can't digest it that fast. So I put it in a little handout, and then you can go back, look at it, remember something that maybe you were forgetting as we were talking earlier, that kind of thing. So hopefully that's a help and doesn't get in your way. But what I start on this handout is the way that I started my book. And that is that the one overarching principle that I work with when I work with students, I actually heard it formulated when I went to a heads conference in Pennsylvania by a man named Roland Barth, who's a Harvard educator, and he says, "You teach who you are." And I got very excited when I heard that, because it rings true. You do teach who you are. You can't help it. It only took me about 7 years, because I'm really quick at things, to realize that students learn who they are. And that's where the big difference begins. You as an individual teacher stand as an individual, you teach who you are, and you grant yourself all the rights of that individuality. But you're standing in front of a group of children or older students, all who learn who they are. And that's a lot of difference in learning. But then it dawned on me, as I was working with many, many, many parents parent who they are. And that requires as deep a respectful understanding as any student needs and as any teacher needs. So that started to be the thing that guided me, both as a teacher and as an administrator. And then when I was no longer connected to a school and I opened my own private practice, what I ended up finding was that the students that came all had very, very similar questions, and every single student needed a different answer, even if their question was exactly the same. And that's where the book was born. Because in that book, whenever you read a quote, it is actually a quote. I taped most of the initial sessions I had with students, and then asked their permission, could I use this if I took out any identifying information? And of course, they always said yes. And then I changed their names, and then they got the book when it was published, and they went fishing, and they dove into it to find themselves. Am I? Well, gosh, I don't know. Do you? Maybe. And that ended up being a very nice piece of it. But what I did when I started working with children individually, and I don't really call them children because I work a lot with middle school students, high school students, but I work with a lot of college-age students too. I went to this concept of salutogenesis, which is the only big word I'm going to use tonight, I promise you. And that word means saluto, which is origin of, no, I'm sorry, health, and genesis, which is origin of. So the origin of health. And the man who started this phrase, this term, was a man named Aaron Antonvasky, and he's an Israeli-American psychologist. And his research went into the question of, why did people survive the Holocaust differently? It was a little bit more specific than that, but that was essentially the question. And one of the things that he came up with was that the ones that survived in health ended up with a sense, it was through a sense of coherence. And then he identified what made up that sense of coherence. And it was three things. It was that the people who ended up with that experience of coherence, which we would call integration, had the experience of comprehensibility. They understood what was happening. Meaningfulness, it was relevant. They found the relevance in it. and it was manageable. They felt like they could cope with what was asked of them. And if you take those three things, and instead of putting in something traumatic like that experience, and instead think of the student that you have in your heart and mind tonight. Do they understand what's happening in their everyday experience? Do they find it relevant? And do they find that they have the tools to meet it? And most often what you find is the answer is maybe not quite, because there's something that's not quite working for them. And usually what we end up discovering is that that has something to do with one of their executive functions. And as we talk about executive functions, it can be, it's used a little bit like well, possibly a bit of a new term or a popular term. But really what it is, in a very small nutshell, is the function of your brain that controls attention and behavior. It's that simple. And if you let it be that simple, you start to realize how connected to absolutely everything that you do that one definition is. The function of the brain that controls your attention and your behavior. So when I was working with the students today, I was able to see the students in grades 7 through 12. And I was actually speaking about this with them. We were trying to figure out what's left. What else does the brain do? Well, it has a speech center, it's maybe got a movement center, but really the executive part of our brain does a lot of work. It also is the part of the brain that develops the most slowly of all and only matures roughly around the age of 30. So all of you represent children who are not yet halfway there. So you have some time. So the stage of development that many of you are picturing your student having, it hopefully is still just a stage, and that things can be done to make a difference. So on this paper, what I did is I basically listed out the executive functions as I use them. And just briefly, when I wrote the book, I was reading everything I could about executive function, and everybody said it differently, and everybody had a different term. And there is no one definitive, scientifically accepted way to talk about them. And it's the only area that I can find that has this remarkable quality of not having a kind of a defined set of definitions. You come a little bit close to it when you look under attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in the new DSM-5. But executive dysfunction by itself is harder to nail. But executive functions can include everything that has to do with how we make decisions, how we engage in action, how we inhibit behaviors, how we organize ourselves in space, how we manage our time. And the way that those things are either separated out or clumped together depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to me, I separate out a little bit more because I see, for example, organization and time management is very often referred to in the same phrase. Very rarely do people separate out that particular space-time continuum. But I really see them as two very separate functions. So when I work with students, the very first thing that we talk about is, of course, attention. And what I would do if this wasn't being taped is I would get you involved in some questions right there to demonstrate to you why I find it so important to point out that our attention is used as either active or passive attention. And this was very interesting for the students today because what I would say to them is, you're actively paying attention to me because you've been asked to sit quietly and pay attention. There's a guest in the room and everybody did that. But what they were passively paying attention to was as important. and affected them possibly even more than the active attention. So what are those passive attentions? For you, how does this chair feel? I just got here, I'm taking a deep breath. Oh, I'm feeling a little bit cold, or I'm feeling a little bit hot, or did I remember to do something before I left the house? And I wonder if so-and-so is still coming. There's an empty chair and I see somebody that I should have, oh, I need to talk to you afterwards. Let me try to remember to do that. Yeah, she's still talking. And we do that as adults, and we allow ourselves to do that because that's normal. But the students struggle with that because their passive attention can become pretty interesting. It can be loud in their heads. And there was, for example, when I was with the 8th grade today, a truck pulled up right outside the window. And what comes off that truck but the new copier? Couldn't get more exciting. So we did. We paid attention to it because that was what was in front of them. And it wasn't possible to move that back to the passive attention side until it had been cleared off the active attention side. And this is a very different way of thinking about attention. And if you think about it for yourselves, what I'm going to probably notice, I'll show you what I pointed out to the students as we went through the day, but you're doing pretty well, most of you. We've been talking now, I've been going on for about 7 minutes, maybe 8, I'm not quite sure. Most of you are still with me. But one by one, you're going to find that the initial attention decision that you walked into this room with is, I'm sorry to have to say it like this, but it's going to die. And when it's dead, as I told the students today, it's like a dead puppy. You can ask it to please come back alive and say, come on, puppy, pay attention. And the puppy is not going to be able to respond because the puppy is dead. And your attention works like that, and so does the students. So when their attention decision to focus on whatever is happening or whatever teacher is going on at that moment or whatever parent is speaking to them, when that attention decision is over, it's over. But why did it die? It died because you need a brain reset. And so as you go through the next few minutes, notice when your personal attention decision dies, you're going to shift position, take a swig of whatever you brought to drink, start writing notes madly, stretch your neck, take a deep breath, look around, wonder when I'm going to stop. Am I going to stop on time? That thought might come to your mind several times tonight. And then you can do a brain reset through those activities and start again with a new attention decision. And what you've done in that interim to get to the brain reset is you have attached your attention to a sensory experience of some kind. You've jiggled your feet, you've moved your leg, you've done something kind of shifty here, and that has given you a new chance. So then the new decision is in place for what? 5, 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you're a really, really mature adult. And then that puppy is going to die too. And then you can start again. But every single time you start, you get to start absolutely fresh. And that decision, as soon as you start it, feels really good. If students can get used to knowing that this is a safe practice and that all of us do it, then the students with what we would call the sort of in the middle of the attention spectrum, they're going to be able to do that very easily, and they'll come in and out of those attention decisions with no bump or glitch. The ones who are on one side or the other side of that attention spectrum might find that when they're on the one side of it, it's what we all call ADHD hyperactive predominantly type. See, I put predominantly in the wrong place in that sentence. The other side of the spectrum is ADHD predominantly inattentive. And that student is going to sit there, and as a teacher, you're thinking, yay, look how attentive this student is being, aren't I good? And the problem is, they're on an attention vacation. They aren't actually there. They're somewhere else. And so their attention vacation took them out. This student has attention has died. And so what do both sides of this spectrum need to do to get back on line? This side has to go through some kind of sensory movement experience. Often it's talking, and then they get back in. This one needs something to happen to make them notice that they're gone so that they can come back. And both of them have to somehow be responsible for keeping track of what's going on in the class at that moment. And that's what's hard. And that's where the students and the teachers end up looking at each other saying, really? And the teacher is saying, can't you stay with it? And the student says, really? Can't you let me just reset every now and then? And actually, the answer to both of those is yes, you can reset. And yes, you can stay with it, but only if you reset frequently. So that was actually a kind of a practical thing I was trying to get across to the students today, that they can bring their effort to the table. And if a teacher can look at the student, or a parent can look at the student and see that their behavior is really not behavior, but it's an expression of what they're trying to sort through with their attention, then it makes it more understandable what's really going on. It doesn't mean that Johnny or Mary are being rude, are being lazy, are being completely unsubordinate. It means Johnny or Mary hasn't figured out how to control these attention decisions. And that any help they can get toward that will actually show up as a change in behavior. So it's just a slightly different way of looking at things. But because attention is so central to executive function, I actually spent quite a bit of time today on that one topic. And I do think that it merits a little time to understand it. But because that was only one way, that was only the first step into executive function, then what I started doing was talking with the students about memory. Because when you are in a situation where your attention is kind of flying all over the place, and you're supposed to be able to auditorily, right now, all you get is your ears. Everything that you're trying to process in your brain right now, and I see resets going on all over the room. I'm so happy about that. That you have nothing else right now. We're not putting up any visuals for you. I'm not dancing around up here because I'm trying to stay within that line of sight. And if you watch this as a video, you could be swirling around in your chair, and you could be yelling at your kids, and you could be eating. All would be fine, but you're in a position of being here in person. So how are you going to try to remember what we talk about tonight? You're going to have a couple of ways. The kids are always concerned, how can I remember what I'm learning? So on this paper are the different ways that we actually do remember things. This isn't completely exhaustive, but it's the key points. So we remember things because we hear them. But what if you're not that student that actually does process input here very well? What if you're that kid that this is hard to sort through sound? Then maybe you need the visual. But what if you're the kid who doesn't need the visual because everything gets jumpy and I get exhausted when I look too much? I need to do it. But maybe it's not the kind of lesson that you can do it that much. This school, more than almost any other, is going to do what they do a lot. But what about all these other memories? The sequential memory. Somebody asked me earlier today, what about my kid who has a hard time with math? And my first question will be, what about sequence? Does the student also have difficulty with sequence? Because sometimes long division is hard because you have a hard time remembering a sequence, not because you have a hard time with math. I've asked everybody today, ask the question, why? So that you don't make an assumption that what you're seeing is because of some preset reason. It's usually not a preset reason. What about auditory memory, factual memory? Factual memory got us onto a really interesting fact. When you try to remember something, the executive function of making a mental picture is probably the one thing that you can do. If I had to bring everything down tonight to 1, 2, or possibly 3 things, making mental pictures is going to be on that very, very short list. Because without that, your executive brain can't work. So it affects your memory, it affects your attention, it affects your decision making, it affects your organization, it affects your time management, it affects everything if you can't form a mental picture. What if you can't form a mental picture of time? What if you can't form a mental picture of how this assignment needs to end up being laid out? What if you can't form a mental picture of how that math problem could be approached successfully? If you can't form a mental picture, it's not going to happen. So within all of these functions, the weaving of them together is actually the real key. But you have to talk about them as if they're separate. And then once you get them out, then you can start to understand how connected they really are. So basically, those memory styles, one of them may be very strong and one of them might be weaker for a certain student. But if at least you know about them, you can at least ask the question. How do I perceive this? How do I see this? How does the student respond? The next one is organization in space. And this is one that a lot of parents, you don't invite each other over to see your child's bedrooms, right? Well, I finally went around. I thought that I was doing something wrong because my kids' bedrooms, when they were, of the age of bedrooms, were a nightmare. And I'm a pretty organized person. I finally took photos just to prove to myself, no, I'm not imagining this. They really do have their rooms like this. I'm going to just keep these pictures and see what happens. And now, many years later, they're pretty funny. But at the time, I wasn't finding it very funny. But it was not because my kids were disorganized. And that's a very interesting thing. What you'll find is their physical organization is actually more worrying, not if their bedroom is a mess, but if their school binder is a mess in such a way that they don't know what to do about it. So when students come to my office with that kind of disorganization and the parents are frantic, the first thing we do is a binder dump, and I watch to see how viscerally the student reacts to the binder dump. If they are relieved, then I know we're on the right track. And if they look like they've just about ready to get a heart attack, then I know that we have a lot more work to do, because then the reason it's disorganized is a deeper reason. If the reason that it's disorganized is conquerable and they're relieved at the organization that comes about in the next 20 minutes, then you think, okay, that's all it was. They just didn't know any better. But there are students for whom actually it's a little bit like a hoarding impulse or a little bit of an OCD impulse or something like that. Then be much more careful. Then it's not just an organizational issue that has to do with executive function. Tread lightly, but be awake. Again, it makes all the difference if you know why. When it comes to being able to organize your thoughts and write a paper, that's where the inner organization and the outer organization may not always be the same. So you have a student who might have a bedroom that looks like that bedroom, but they may actually be a very clear and organized thinker. They may actually have a very clear, organized emotional life. But their physical world, right then, it's their duty to completely make you mad with their bedroom being a mess. It's kind of like that belongs to the 14 to 16-year-old relationship, right? Or 12 or 10 or whatever it is. It's their duty to be like that. Now, the fact that most people connect organization and time management. Like I said before, I disconnected those two because the organization, the inner and outer physical organization, I find is very different from a student's relationship with time. Now notice I didn't say time management because you can't manage something you have no relationship with. It's not that complicated. But what's complicated is to figure out what do they have a relationship with. So what the students were surprised by today here, I figured I was safe by telling them this. About 8 out of 10 students that I meet cannot tell me what time it is on an analog clock. 8 out of 10 students I meet cannot tell me either what the first day of the month of the year is and how to sequence through to December without making a mistake. And I'm talking high school students. 8 out of 10 kids I work with leave October out of the year. Oh, right, October. It's always October for some reason. I don't know why. So then I ask them to show me how they mentally image time. And they don't know what I'm talking about. So then I say, okay, well, let's do this. Where does the sun come up in the morning? In the sky? Honestly, it's a little scary. So I try not to I've gotten past the point where I've sort of gobsmacked over something like that. And I've gotten to the point where I can actually work with it and start working with them about how to see and perceive time. And what we'd end up doing is talking about how they picture the different kinds of time. And then I realize they have very different relationships to the different kinds of time. So I know that we're being filmed right now, but let me just do a very quick down and dirty little exercise with you. Normally I would ask you to stand up, but I'm going to have you keep seated right now so we don't get in the way of it. But put your hand randomly in the air, just point someplace. And I'm going to ask you to show me your visual of how you get from January to February, keep going, March, April, May, June, July, I'm loving it, August, September, October, November, December, January. Aha. Now, this is why I know you've done incredible work with planners, but this is why planners are challenging. How many of you see time visually exactly the same way? And when you do it in a group like this, and after February, everybody's off in another direction, and then you say, okay, now kids, put it on a planner. That's where the challenge comes in. Now do the same thing, and it's the first of the month. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, da, 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 da. And that, believe it or not, is 99% exactly the same. Everybody sees the month in the same way. So seeing the calendar month laid out like that, we've all kind of been trained. Although you've got your Googles or your iCalendars, you got your verticals there, and they see the month as a vertical, agenda line. Now do the same thing for the days of the week. We'll pretend that the week starts on a Sunday, but the kids today were determined it was Monday. But we'll pretend it's Sunday. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. How do you get back to Sunday? Monday. So there is a little more consistency there, but by no means the same consistency as with a month. Now show me where your 6 o'clock in the morning is. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now what you'll be very surprised to know is that if you're not in this circle like yourselves that has an education system behind you that's actually taught you what the sun direction is, that is all over the map, how people see the hours of the day. So here we have 4 different ways of seeing time, and there's not a lot of consistency. There shouldn't be, really, but there isn't a lot of consistency. So when you have students who say, when you say you've got 2 hours, then you have to wonder, what do they picture when you say 2 hours? And chances are very good they picture absolutely nothing. So when you say to them, all right, here's your 10-minute warning, your 10-minute warning is equal to 2 hours because they don't picture anything. So when that's happening, then you need to break it down and give somebody a picture. And that's where the visual timers, the time timer, that type of thing, where you actually have a visual timer of time moving. And the 3rd grade curriculum in a Waldorf school does this beautifully, but there are so many people in the world that have no idea how to imagine time on anything other than a digital clock. So I asked one teenage boy to tell me what time it was on that exact moment, and he said whatever it was, 2:23. So what happened just before 2:23? I have no idea. Why? It's gone. Well, what's happening right after 2:23? Well, I have no idea. It's not here yet. So that was actually, I would say, a fairly serious disconnect for that particular person to not have any way of picturing time except for a simple readout of the number of that moment. There was no picture of time before that, no picture of time after that. So instead of working on time with this particular boy, I went right to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is that that student had no idea how to either review or preview. And probably, I would say, if you walk out of here tonight with nothing else, I would hope that you walk out of here willing to try review and preview. How I usually advise students to do this is at night when you're brushing your teeth or doing something that has a short-lived cycle because you don't need a lot of time for it, think through your day backwards. And the backwards is absolutely important for executive function because when you are using executive function, one of the things that you're doing is you are trying to say to yourself, this is the miniature, the version. Last time I was in this situation, I did X, Y, or Z. How did that work for me? Pretty good. I think I'll do that again. Or not so good. I think I'm going to change my behavior and make a new decision. Now, that's a kind of, took me, a couple of seconds to say that. That happens within a nanosecond 3 or 4 times for everybody who's working with their executive function. Yeah, last time I was in this room and I was listening quietly to a speaker, that seemed to be a socially acceptable thing to do. I'm going to do that again tonight. Or for a student, the last time I interrupted my teacher, he or she asked me to hold on to my remark for another minute. Maybe that's what they're going to ask me again. I think I'm going to see if I can do that. I'll hold back. I'll inhibit one of the things on this paper tonight. I'll inhibit my behavior because that's what I'm trying to learn how to do. So if you don't reflect and review backwards, you're actually not doing that activity, which is connected to the executive brain. And then right after you do your review, I'm brushing my teeth now, and just before that I did whatever, I finished my homework, and before that we had dinner, and oh yeah, I liked it. And before that I was at sports practice, and before that was my last period of the day. What was that? What was that? Oh yeah, I remember now. And before that was the next to the last period of the day, and so on. And oh my gosh, I forgot I have English homework. I have to remember to do that. And then I got up. Now tomorrow, I have first thing in the morning, main lesson, then I have blah, blah, then I have blah, blah, then I have blah, blah. So you review the day you've just had backwards, and you preview the coming day forward. And by doing that, you have actually inserted yourself into the executive flow of your brain. It is amazing what this does. People who have good executive function do this all the time. And they do it so seamlessly that it doesn't cost them anything. For people who are learning it, you have to become aware of it. It's like learning how to knit. You learn how to knit in through the front door, out around the back, peeping through the window, and off jumps Jack, one stitch. You have done it, but it took you a long time. When you're a fast knitter, and there's somebody looking through the door, the window back there, if they need to open the door. When you become a fast knitter, you're just going, you're not thinking about it because you've learned it. And that's how it is with a lot of these executive ideas. Once you've learned them, they become more and more easy to do with no effort. But sometimes you have to break it down and identify what is it that you need to do so that you can learn it, so that it can become automatic. And that review and preview is a very, very important one. Now, as you can see, some of these things we've already mentioned already because the weaving really starts in on going together. Initiative and inhibition. Whenever I work with a student on those two things, the very first thing I have to do is ask them, do they even know what the words mean? And very often, even with the high school and college students, the answer is no, I really don't. And that to their credit, they admit it. But to not know what initiative means and to not know what to inhibit means that you aren't really working with the idea of a stop and go button. And that's what that part of executive control really is. Sometimes I need to go, and sometimes I need to stop. And the situations are as varied as there are minutes in the day for what you need to do. Today we watched it happen. In one of the classes, the go button was on for one girl, and that girl spoke right over one boy. One boy hit his stop button and stopped talking and let her finish. One of them had to hit the stop button for it to be a socially acceptable situation. And then next time, the hope would be that the one who got the go button one time is going to use the stop button and let the other one finish. So we talked about that. They actually let me use that as an example of how you can inhibit or how you can initiate. And then what you do with your initiated activity is at some point you've got to inhibit it again. Because that's what breathing is all about. So inhibition and initiative are constantly in communication with each other. And the flexibility, for example, in that example that I shared from the students today, that girl would have had to show in that moment enough flexibility to assess, oh, I'm talking too much. So-and-so was trying to talk and I'm not letting him. How about if I put my stop button on and let him finish? I'll be flexible. You know how quick that happens. That's like between one word and the next, that's a breath. And it's done. But that didn't happen. He did that. He was flexible in that situation. So as you understand some of this stuff, what's behind it is really interesting. Now, when you come to reaction and response mode, that's the control of behavior directly and also controlling emotions. So as you work with students, when you talk about controlling their behavior and controlling their emotions, you have to be so careful because who's the person in control? They are. But if you're the one talking about it, what do they feel like? That you've just taken control. So you have to be really careful with this one. But the idea is that a response is a chosen behavior, and a reaction happens a little bit of its own volition. Now, it's within this reaction and response mode, and within the whole thing of being able to, this last one, this control of emotions, parents and teachers enter into it and they get really, really messed up with two words. They're two-letter words. Any guess what they are? Trips you up every time. Any guess? The first one, if. Because you up the ante, it is absolutely the ultimate threat word. The only thing that you can do with that word is hurt somebody. it's really true that you can only go to a stronger reaction once you've placed if in that particular way out there as part of the conversation. And the other one is the ultimate negotiator. Okay? Okay? It's a negotiation. And the balance of power is off the minute you use those words. So these two areas, control of emotion and behavior, and control of emotion and behavior, are your ultimate power sources. You can either give power in those two areas, or you can take it. You can teach it, or you can inhibit it. So that's just something that teachers and parents have all come across. They all know that one. And then setting goals is on my list, but many people who talk about executive function say that setting goals is so inherent in it that it is that behavior of reflecting on an action, remembering what you did last time, making a new decision, and making a decision to start it again. That's what they say is goal setting. I like to put it out as a separate activity because sometimes it's good to just think about what are my goals beyond the ones that are happening right now, even as I speak, for example. So because of a short evening, we're not going to get into that. This could become, you can imagine, a week-long seminar, and we could go into all of these in great detail. Now, here's where I didn't write the book in the way I've just presented to you tonight. What I did with the book is I put what are now ingredients, I put them first. And so you don't even, if you look at the book, you don't even get into the executive function till the second half. Because I realized what nobody tells you is that you have to have tools in order to approach these executive functions. You can't just hear about them and say, bingo, I've got it. Now let's get down to business and do it. Because you don't have the tools yet. And because I spent a good deal of my life cooking for a lot of people, and I was in Kimberton in Pennsylvania, and I would get a 5-gallon bucket of vegetables at my door on the morning, and that was what I cooked. So for 11 years, I didn't own a cookbook, but I looked at my ingredients, and I said, what needs to happen today? Took the ingredients, and I made it happen. That's why this book is based on the ingredients first, because of that experience. It's the same thing as if somebody hands you a box of tools and says, build a house, but they don't mention to you how to use those tools, and so it's a little awkward. You've got all these great tools, and you don't know how to use them. So you can't do anything with them. So that's why this list is really important. So even though we're going to go through it kind of at the speed of light tonight, go over it again for yourself and ask, where do I have these tools available? And the very first tool, and what starts the book in the #1 slot, took me a while to figure out which one had to go there, but it's relationship. Because without the ability to enter into effective relationship, a lot of these executive functions that we talked about don't work. How does a student make a relationship to his or her parents or family? How does that student make a relationship to the teachers or peers? How do they make relationships to other people in their lives, such as their coaches? And then the kicker is, how do you make a relationship to yourself? And that becomes more and more crucial the older the student gets. When they're young, that isn't what stands out. But middle school and up, that stands out. And the way that develops will determine a lot about how the student is able to use and engage with the other executive functions. Good, we're going to go speed of light. Strengths and weaknesses, every student needs to know what they are. They need to know it in relationship to how they are at school, how they are at home. That's a self-reflective activity. It's very difficult if the child is too young. But definitely by high school, you can really start to be a bit more honest about what your strengths and weaknesses are. The review and preview I've already spoken about because it almost got first place. But you know how awards go. Now, self-advocacy to self-responsibility, I think I'm going to spend my time on that because it's so important. Here's my pet peeve. How many of you know that self-advocacy is the big hot topic in education? You have to self-advocate. Go ahead. And here's my problem with it, and I'll tell it to you fast. A baby is born, and the baby is fed, carried, warm, dried, slept, cooed at, everything you need, baby, you've got it. Nobody would do it any differently. I really hope nobody would do it any differently. Toddler gets a little bit more in the direction of, so if you're hungry, let's get you something to eat, and if you're tired, sweetie, it's time for a nap, and I know you really want to put your pink boots on, so why don't we just go ahead and put your pink boots on, and are you cold? Let's get a jacket. You need to go potty, quick, let's go. Child goes into first grade. Now, this is going to be extreme, probably doesn't happen here. You will sit when I tell you to sit. You will hang your coat when I tell you to hang your coat. You will go potty when I tell you it's time to go potty. You will drink when I tell you to drink. You will eat when I tell you it's time. And if you're tired and if you need to move, too bad, recess will come later. And by the way, if you have a problem, you need to self-advocate. What? Where did that happen? And how did that come about? So think about that. It's a kind of an extreme example, but it's my problem with self-advocacy because self-advocacy is based on a student having essentially enough self-knowledge to be able to tell you what they need because they have reflected on their strengths and weaknesses, and they actually know how they make relationships, and they understand where their executive functions aren't working, and so could you please help me here? But you see on most reports from other schools, student A needs to learn to self-advocate. And then I go into the IEP meetings and I say, can we talk about this? So now, just to finish it off, practice and repetition, there's a very big difference between practice and repetition. It's the same difference as rhythm and routine. So your rhythm is your birthday comes around every year, but it's never the same birthday twice. You breathe in and out. Every time you breathe, it's a little bit different. And when you practice, you sit down at the piano and you play your 5 pieces. So you're playing for 20 minutes, but you're not playing the same thing the whole time. Repetition is quite different. Sports, you have to have repetition. 10 reps. 1, 2. You hopefully don't do each one. 1, 2, 3. You do the same rep. You do the same skill set. You practice for muscle memory. You do C major scale until you get it perfect. And that means every time it's exactly the same. Practice and rhythm, routine and repetition. Those are the relationships. Motivation and incentive is what we will now end this section on, because I don't know if any of you have ever let out of your mouth the words or the thought even that your student is just lazy. I have been working with students for a very, 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 very long time, and I've met a lot of them. I have never, ever met a lazy student. And if you find one, bring them to me because they need to be preserved and put into the Smithsonian. I have found students that are differently motivated than you and I are. And I have found students who are motivated by things that are different than the teacher is motivated by. And I have met students who basically want to say to you, I don't really respond to incentives because incentives must be based on reward and punishment. And that's where, whenever you see these books that say, are we a reward culture? Are we basically giving our children too much praise? And I'm saying, don't worry about the praise because that's just as damaging as all these threats. And Roland Barth also said, our educational system is based on this principle: learn or we will hurt you. I will grade you, I will punish you, I will put you in detention, I will prevent you from getting into college, I'll do something, but I'll hurt you. And that's not the system that you have here. But the incentive system has that inherently in it. the reward punishment paradigm has to include that, both sides of that pendulum. Motivation is something that's absolutely intrinsic within the student, and basically it's really hard for adults to hear this, but you can't touch it. You have no access. You have to leave it alone. And the reason so many parents and teachers hammer away at kids with incentives is because they're so frustrated that they can't reach the motivation inside that student. You cannot motivate a student from the outside. Stop trying, because it's going to fail. And what you keep saying that you're doing is trying to motivate them, and what you're really doing is you're putting incentives out there and you're threatening. So that's a kind of an awful thing to end on in this section. But the other two, we don't need to go too much into detail, because implicit, explicit, synthesis, and analysis, you can read more about it in my book. They are interesting. It's just that for tonight, we might have had just about enough. But at the end of this, what I tried to put together were, if you walk out of here with anything, please note that the attention decisions work. Review and preview is the healthiest activity that you could engage in if you want to strengthen your executive skill set. If you're going to try to change something, remember that you can't change the students from the outside very easily. But if you're going to effect a change, you have to start really small and do one thing at a time, which we didn't really speak about tonight. But remember, you teach who you are, the students learn who they are, and you parents, God bless you, have to parent who you are, which is all good. So let's go ahead and turn off the camera, and then we can have some fun and ask some questions.